Morning, class. Welcome back. We are into our second lesson in our second week of class together online. So this is what lesson four, and I think what we're going to do is lesson four is going to be broken up into two parts. We're continuing to explore the idea of justice. Over the last three lessons and the quizzes reviews that we've done and the notes that you have, we've sought to build for ourselves a vocabulary around justice. So we've argued for a particular definition of biblical justice, and then four aspects of that justice: retributive justice, restorative justice, distributive justice, and procedural justice. And now we're looking to uh, explore how to apply those concepts of justice to our world, and beyond just like how do we treat our neighbor in the hallway, but bigger issues, right? Bigger issues. And the one we're going to use as our example is the idea of capital punishment. So question: should we, as Christians, um, execute or support the execution of criminals? Why or why not? And part of the um, part of the relevant or part of the reason that we might pick this one is this is one where Christians uh, disagree, I think hopefully amicably, graciously, um, and yet we all understand that this is something that really, really matters. So what we're going to do is we're going to read two different articles, one by Charles Colson, and the other, and another one responding to it, um, are about capital punishment. And the way we're going to do this is we'll read through each article, and for both articles, we're going to look at the same at a worksheet, two copies of the same worksheet. You'll notice here on the worksheet that I'm asking you to do the MLA header, right, and fill out the citation. Now I've given you the format for the citation, so author's name, uh, title of the article, title of the website, website publisher, if it's different than the website title. Wink, wink, it's not in this case. And date of publication and the URL. That's the web address. Okay. So hopefully that's familiar to us, more familiar at least than it was back in the first quarter the last time we did something like this. And the other thing is we've been reviewing some categories both of writing and of like thought and argument, right? So I'm going to ask you for the thesis statement. Find the thesis statement. What kind of thesis is it? Then I'm gonna ask you to do something fairly lengthy. I'm gonna ask you to summarize the whole article. So you should expect to have 1 point for really each paragraph, at least 1 point for each paragraph listed. If you're summarizing these articles in 2 or 3 lines, you're not giving me a detailed enough summary. I'm looking for a detailed summary on this. Um, how does the particular problem relate back to sin according to the author? What sorts of appeals does the author make, and then can you quote examples? So is it a ethos, logos, or pathos? Uh, be on the lookout for those sorts of appeals and go back to your Unit 10 notes. All the definitions of all of those are there. And then logical fallacies. This is all in your course notes. You've been practicing them on the quizzes. We talked about them at the beginning of last unit, right? So be on the lookout for logical fallacies. Do you find any? Look carefully. What claim is the author making about the good life? What makes life good? What are examples of injustice? And what are examples of justice according to the article? And what does the author argue we ought to do regarding capital punishment? Okay. Now this is lengthy. It's complicated. In class, what we would do is we would read together, and then we would seek to fill this out together. So that's going to be a little bit tricky. I think it'd be really tough to do that in like a Google Meet or a Zoom. Um, so what we're going to do is I'm going to, in the first half of this video, I'm going to read to you, and I know you can read. So if this doesn't help you, by all means, skip it and read it for yourself. But I'm going to read to you the article. This is going to take a little while. It's a lengthy article. Um, and then in part two, or in part B of this of the lesson four, which will be a separate video, I'll walk through how uh, how we might answer the questions in the worksheet. But in between then, in between reading it and going through the video together, I'd like you to give you your best shot in answering those questions. Okay, spend half hour seeking to answer the questions. Then go back and check your work against the answers that I found um, uh, in part B of the video. Make sense? You with me? All right, let's get going. So it says, Why I Support Capital Punishment by Charles Colson. Notice the date, February 21st, 2017. So let's give us some context. And there's an editor's note, or sorry, this is a publication date. I think Colson wrote this some years prior. But this is a publication date. Okay. Editor's note. Last month, a unanimous jury sentenced Dylan Roof to death. So they're going to execute him. They're going to subject him to capital punishment. He's being executed for killing 9 black churchgoers as they attended Bible study in a Charleston, South Carolina church. Maybe you remember this story. It was a couple years ago now, but um, uh, maybe you remember it. The reaction to Roof's sentencing has rekindled discussions, even amongst victims' families, about whether Christians should support capital punishment. To consider both sides of the debate, the Gospel Coalition (TGC) is presenting personal essays on the death penalty by Matthew Arbo, assistant professor of biblical and theological studies at Oklahoma Baptist University, and by the late Charles W. Colson, founder of Prison Fellowship. So Dr. Colson has passed away a number of years ago, but his essay remains, I think, powerful and helpful to us. So we're going to start with Dr. Colson's um, uh, essay, and then we'll go to Dr. Arbo's um, here in probably next week. Okay, so Dr. Colson says this: as Christians grow and cultivate the disciplines of reading and study, we sometimes alter our views. Sometimes these views even change dramatically. No one knows this better than I do, having been dramatically converted to Christ and subsequently having my entire worldview turned upside down. There was a time, for example, when I thought that John Locke's understanding of the social contract was the ultimate theory of government. You probably haven't discussed that yet in class. You will next year, and if not next year, the year after. Okay. Um, I now see that government draws its authority less from the consent of the governed than from the sovereignty of God. I have come to another of those points in my spiritual pilgrimage, in which my views have undergone significant change. For as long as I can remember, I have opposed capital punishment. As a lawyer, I observed how flawed the legal system is, and I concluded, as Justice Learned Hand once remarked, that it is better that 100 guilty men go free than for one guilty man be executed. I was also influenced by my very libertarian views of government. I distrusted government too much to give power to the judicial system to take human life. Then I became a Christian. I was confronted with the reality of Jesus' payment of the debt of human sin. I discovered that the operation of God's marvelous grace in our lives uh, has profound implications for the way we live. Naturally, I came to deal increasingly with ethical issues. I found myself seriously questioning whether the death penalty was an effective deterrent. My views were very much influenced by Deuteronomy 17 and the need for 2 eyewitnesses. I questioned whether the circumstantial evidence on which most are sentenced today, in fact, meets the standard of proof. I still have grave reservations about the way in which capital punishment is administered in the United States, and I still do question whether it is a deterrent. In fact, I remain convinced that it is not a general deterrent. But my views have changed. I now favor capital punishment, at least in principle, but only in extreme cases when no other punishment can satisfy the demands of justice. Mercy requires justice. The reason is quite simple. Justice, in God's eyes, requires that the response to an offense, whether against God or against humanity, be proportionate, be equal, fitting. Right? The lex talionis, the law of the talion, or the law of retaliation, serves as a restraint, a limitation to ensure the punishment would be no greater than the crime. Yet, implied therein is a standard that the punishment should be at least as great as the crime. One frequently finds among Christians the belief that Jesus' so-called quote love ethic sets aside the law of the talion. To the contrary, Jesus affirms the divine basis of the Old Testament ethic. Nowhere does he set aside all the requirements of the civil law. Further, it leads to a perversion of legal justice to confuse the sphere of private relations with that of civil law. While the thief on the cross found pardon in the sight of God, today you will be with me in paradise, Jesus says to him, the pardon did not extend to eliminating the consequences of his crime. We are being justly punished, the thief says, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. What about mercy? One may be inclined to ask. My response is simple. There can be no mercy where justice is not satisfied. Justice entails receiving what we in fact deserve. We did in fact know better. Mercy is not receiving what we deserve. To be punished, however severely, because we indeed deserve it, as C.S. Lewis observed, is to be treated with dignity as human beings created in God's image. Conversely, to abandon the criteria of righteous and just punishment, as Lewis also points out, is to abandon all criteria for punishment. Indeed, mercy extended to offenders whose guilt is certain, yet ignored, creates a moral travesty that, over time, helps pave the way for the collapse of the entire social order. This is essentially the argument of Romans 13. Romans 12 concludes with a prescription of prescription of personal retribution. Yet Paul immediately follows this with a divinely instituted uh, prescription for punishing moral evil. It is for eminently social reasons that the authorities are to wield the sword. The shoot here I have no Latin. Is gladi, due to human government wields the sword is what that's referring to. Due to human depravity and the need for moral social order, the civil magistrate punishes criminal behavior. The implication of Romans 13 is that by not punishing moral evil, authorities are not performing their God-appointed responsibility in society. Paul's teaching in Romans 13 squares with his experience. Testifying before Festus, he certifies, if I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. Acts 25:11. Perhaps the emotional evidence that pushed me over the philosophical edge was the John Wayne Gacy case some years ago. This is a deeply, deeply disturbing case if you look it up on Wikipedia. Um, I visited him on death row during our Dr. Colson says during our hour-long conversation. He was totally unrepentant. In fact, he was arrogant. He insisted that he was a Christian, that he believed in Christ, and yet showed no hint of remorse. The testimony in the trial, of course, was overwhelming. I don't think anyone could possibly believe that he didn't commit those unspeakably barbaric crimes. What I realized in the days prior to Gacy's execution was that there was simply no other appropriate response than execution if justice was to be served. There are some cases like this. There are some cases like this. The Oklahoma City bombing is a case in point. When no other response is appropriate, no other punishment suffices for the deliberate savagery of the crime. You may need to go back and look up the Oklahoma City bombings well before you were born, maybe something post 9/11 that we've sort of forgotten about as a country, but I remember it, at least vaguely. The issue boils down ultimately to just deserts. Indeed, just punishment is a thread running through the whole Bible. Moreover, there is divinely instituted tension between mercy and justice, a tension that, ethically speaking, may not be eradicated, may not be done away with. Mercy without justice makes a mockery of the sacrifice of the Lamb of God. It ignores the fundamental truth of biblical anthropology. The soul that sins must die. Sin incurs a debt that must be paid. Punitive dealings provide a necessary atonement and restore the moral balance disturbed by sin. Purification, one of the most central biblical themes, reveals to us both the temporal and eternal perspective, both temporal and eternal perspectives on humanity. Purification comes by way of suffering. It 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 prepares the individual to meet his maker. God's redemptive response to the sin dilemma did not and does not eradicate the need to bear the consequences for our actions, the need for moral accountability. Which leads me to my second observation. The death penalty ultimately confronts us with the issue of moral accountability in the present life. Contemporary society seems unwilling to assign moral responsibility to anyone. Everything is imaginable is due to a dysfunctional family or having our knuckles rapped while we were in grade school. We have reached the point where the Menendez brothers, who murdered their parents, pleaded for mercy and get it because they are orphans after acknowledging that they made themselves orphans by killing their parents. Non-Christians and Christians alike are not absolved from the consequences of their behavior. Whether or not faith is professed, penalties for everything from speeding to strangulation apply to all. In American society, people are literally getting away with murder, and the moral stupor that has descended over our culture reflects a decay and an utter erosion of time-tested moral norms, norms that have been guarded for generations. Can anyone really wonder why evidence of moral dry rot is everywhere? I come to this view with something of a heavy heart. Um, as someone, uh, as someone, as some of the most blessed brothers I have known in my Christian walk were on death row. I think of Richard Moore in particular, and of course Rusty Woomer, of whom I've written in The Body. I think of Bob Williams in Nebraska and Johnny Cochran in Texas. I have a heavy heart as well because I don't believe that the system administers justice fairly. It is merely symbolic it is merely symbolic justice to execute 25 people a year when 2,000 are sentenced. Obviously, the system needs to be thoroughly revamped. Nevertheless, revamping the system in order that punishment be both swift and proportionate would accord with biblical guidelines and demands Christian engagement. In spite of the system's flaws, I believe I've come to believe, in fact, I've come to believe God, in fact, requires capital punishment, at least in the case of premeditated murder, where there is no doubt of the offender's guilt. This is, after all, the one crime in the Bible where there is no this is the sorry after all this after all is the one crime in the Bible for which no uh, restitution was possible. Numbers 35, 31, and 33. Lest we believe the Old Testament was characterized by indiscriminate capital justice. The Old Testament law painstakingly distinguishes between premeditated murder and involuntary manslaughter, killing someone by accident. Hence, the function of the cities of refuge. This was the means by which you could get, like, try to get a fair trial. You fled to a city of refuge. Um, in the case of involuntary manslaughter, deliverance from the avenger's hand occurred. In the case of murder, the convicted criminal was put to death. Personally, I still doubt the death penalty is a general deterrent, and strong evidence suggests it's not likely to be a deterrent when it's so seldomly invoked. But I have a hard time escaping the attitude of the biblical writers that judgment, both temporal and eschatological, like God in the end times, or final judgment from God, is uh, is a certain reality for those who disobey and reject God's authority. We'll never know how many potential murderers are deterred by the threat of the death penalty, just as we'll never know how many lives may be saved by it. But at the bare minimum, it may deter a convict sentenced to life from killing a prison guard or another convict. In such case, no other punishment is appropriate since since all lesser punishments have been exhausted, and it will certainly prevent a convicted murderer from murdering again. In this regard, I find wisdom in the words of John Stuart Mill. As for what is called the failure of death punishment, who is able to judge of that? We partly know who those are who it has not deterred, but who is there who knows whom it has deterred, or how many human beings it has saved? Who would have lived to be murderers if that awful association had not been thrown round the idea of murder from their earliest infancy? God's non-negotiable standard. So, in spite of my misgivings, I've come to see capital punishment as an essential element of justice. On the whole, the full range of biblical data weighs in its favor. Societies should not execute capital offenders merely for the sake of revenge, but to balance the scales of moral justice that have been disturbed. The death penalty is warranted and should be implemented only in those cases where evidence is certain, in accordance with the biblical standard, and where no other punishment can satisfy the means of justice. In the public debate over the death penalty, we are dealing with the values of we are dealing with the values of the highest order: respect for the sacredness of human life and its protection, the preservation of order in society, and the attainment of justice through law. The function of biblical sanction against heinous crime such as murder is to discourage the wanton destruction of human life, and to undergird the biblical sanctions against murder uh, is the utter sacred character of human life. The shedding of blood in response to sorry, the shedding of blood in Israel polluted the land, and a pollution for which there was no substitute, thus required the death penalty. This is the significance of the sanctions in Genesis 9 against those who would shed the blood of another. It is because humans are created in God's image that capital punishment for premeditated murder was to be a perpetual obligation. To kill a person was tantamount was equivalent to killing God in effigy, to killing like a to killing an image of God. Right? The Noahic covenant, which we talked about, Genesis 9, uh, uh, antedates Israel and the Mosaic Code. It it transcends the Old Testament law per se, and mirrors ethical legislation binding for all cultures and all eras. And I think we see that also in Acts when at the Council of Jerusalem, which we'll talk about next year, uh, the uh, the Noahic covenant is reaffirmed by the apostles. The sanctity of human life is rooted uh, in the universal creation ethic and thus retains its force in society. Any culture that fails to distinguish between the criminal and punitive act, in my opinion, is a culture that cannot survive. In this way, then, my own ethical thinking has evolved. I am well aware that sincere Christians stand on both sides of this issue. One's views on the death penalty are by no means a test of fellowship. It's not that what he's saying is that unlike whether or not you believe Jesus is Lord, whether or not you believe Jesus died and was raised again from the dead, um, uh, the, so those issues, did Jesus really rise from the dead or not? Um, uh, is Jesus the Savior? Is Jesus God incarnate? If you don't believe those things, then you're going to have to be removed from the church. You're not going to be able to be a member in good standing in the church. Those are things that we would divide over. Um, uh, the death penalty, whether or not the death penalty is just, is not a thing that as churches we ought to, I think, divide over, though we may have substantive disagreement. So he says it's not a means of a test of fellowship. Um, while we take no pleasure in defining the contours of this difficult ethical issue, the Christian community is called on to articulate um, standards of biblical justice, even when it may be unpopular. Capital justice, I've come to believe, is part of that non negotiable ethical standard. A moral obligation. A moral obligation requires civil government to punish crime and consequently to enforce capital punishment, albeit under highly restricted conditions. Fallible humans will continue to work for justice, but fallible as the system may be, part of the Christian's task is to remind surrounding culture that actions indeed have consequences in this life and in the life to come. So that concludes um, that concludes uh, uh, our reading of Why I Support Capital Punishment by Charles Colson, published by the Gospel Coalition on February 21st, 2017. So now your task is to spend next half hour or so um, working your way through the questions on the article analysis worksheet found in Google Classroom. Okay. Once you've spent some time going through those, taking a shot at those, you can come back and watch part 2 of this video, or part B of this video, where I'll walk through my assessment of the article using our article analysis worksheet. Okay, love you guys. God bless you. I miss you. I can't wait to be back in class with you. Hopefully that'll be soon, but who knows? We'll see. Love you guys. God bless. Have a great day.